Hello, cooking enthusiasts. This is sort of part two in my homemade guanciale series. In last week's video, I went over the general process I used to make the guanciale, as well as showing off the finished product for one of the two versions. In this video, we are going to be cooking the relatively conventional guanciale to a really classic carbonara. I have covered carbonara several times on the channel, but this is my first time using homemade guanciale, so I couldn't resist, and we'll go over it one more time. You saw earlier in the footage, we chopped up the guanciale, and I like to get a small portion of it rendering in the warming up frying pan. Once it starts to release some of its own fat, the rest of the guanciale goes in, and you use a moderately high heat to get everything crispy. I think it's really unnecessary to add any type of additional oil for this dish. I know probably most people don't measure things for carbonara, but I have some basic ratios that I like. For every 100 grams of dried pasta, I like between 60 and 75 grams of the guanciale or similar product. I also like around 25 to 30 grams of cheese, either Parmesan, Pecorino, or a mixture. The eggs are a less clean ratio. For one portion, I usually like to go luxurious with 2 or 3 egg yolks directly. For every additional person or portion of pasta, I would probably only add 1 extra egg yolk. And if I was ever doing a really big portion, I would probably throw in 1 whole egg to make the mixture stretch a little more. Once the guanciale was nice and crispy, we removed roughly half from the pan. This is so it can be used more as a garnish because it looks nice and it allows you to sort of customize the amount of guanciale on each portion. And we were using a capellini, which is kind of related to angel hair. Definitely not as classic. You would usually use a regular spaghetti or a slightly thicker spaghettoni. Another very critical step was finishing the pasta in the pan with all of the guanciale fat to get everything nice and hot. The mixture then has enough residual heat to really cook the egg and cheese mixture with the help of pasta water and the room temperature mixing bowl ensures that you don't curdle the eggs. Then you just plate it with warm bowls, garnish it with the pancetta, and optionally a little more black pepper and or cheese. And despite having made this dish many times, both very classical and non-classical versions, this was definitely the best carbonara I've ever made. Many times in the past, I have made this dish with either a store-bought pancetta as well as homemade pork belly pancetta and my experimental pig face pancetta. And that last version includes the pork cheek, so you would think it would be similar to a traditional guanciale, but in practice it behaves quite differently. Even though individual cheeks are much smaller with a lot of surface area relative to a pork belly or a entire rolled up pig face, all of their surface area is essentially guarded by either skin or fatty tissue. So in practice, they lose moisture much more slowly than even the larger pieces of charcuterie. And I think taking that long really contributes to the development of the flavor and tenderness. With almost all of my previous carbonara videos, I needed to cook the charcuterie sous vide so it was nice and tender for me, and everyone I was serving it to also enjoyed that texture, but it was unnecessary with this homemade guanciale. So what you have been watching now is my dad opening up the second guanciale, which was the one with the more experimental seasoning. As I mentioned briefly in the previous video, we accidentally removed it early from the dry aging bags, so we actually put it back to continue aging this dry aging wrap and netting. And once I decided it was done, I gave it a few days in a standard vacuum bag to equalize moisture content. And the camera is still dirty, but we will power through. The intended flavor profile for this guanciale was honey garlic. In practice, though, I would say the honey flavor doesn't really come through. But what does come through is the dried mushrooms I added for a unique little savory highlight. So those savory, earthy flavors became much more the focus in the final product, but it's still really delicious and unique. Now, even though I don't taste the honey as much, I do wonder if it actually extended the drying time because honey is so hygroscopic. And again, a longer aging time generally relates to more flavor and texture development. It's also curious to consider that this guanciale developed absolutely zero surface mold, whereas the other one developed some nice white mold and a little bit of green that we trimmed off. Now, sometimes that white mold is actually neutral or desirable for charcuterie, but it is interesting to consider that even a small amount of honey on the surface could totally eliminate it, depending on what you wanted. Finally, we will finish this video by using the guanciale in a dish, this time something much less traditional. We previously fried off a little bit to just taste it straight, And again, I could really get those dried mushroom seasonings on the outside, which is nice. For fried rice, I do something very non-traditional and add a little creme fraiche to my eggs because I like creme fraiche in any sort of scrambled egg type application. We then fry off the rest of the guanciale and then take it out. Then we are cooking the egg first. Again, I prefer a particularly soft scramble for most applications. This may have been even a little too soft, actually. After the eggs, we cook off ginger and garlic as the aromatics, followed by the vegetables. This was just a bunch of leftovers from previous stir frying and some frozen peas. Now, my dad was just throwing this together, but I think the ratio of vegetables to rice was a little bit off. We either needed a little less vegetables or a little more rice. And of course, this is leftover rice. Even though the ratio was a little bit off, the texture of the rice was still very good. And we were hoping to do this outside on the big wok burner, but the weather wasn't right. Finally, we season with a little bit of soy sauce and cooking wine around the rim of the wok, bring everything back together, and finish with really a ridiculous amount of scallion. Still, it was a really delicious dish, a really good application of this guanciale. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions about the guanciale or the dishes, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, thank you for watching.